At my divorce hearing, I sat quietly in a stiff chair while my ex-husband's lawyer paced the courtroom like he was performing for an audience. He turned to the judge and said, "She's just trying to take what she didn't earn." His voice was sharp, confident, and cruel. I stared straight ahead. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I kept my mouth shut because I knew if I spoke, I'd say something that would give him exactly what he wanted. Another excuse to paint me as unstable, emotional, irrational. I stayed still. Then my son stood up. Eli was 10 years old, barely tall enough to see over the edge of the courtroom bench. He clutched a tattered spiral notebook against his chest like it was armor. His voice was quiet but clear as he asked the judge, "Can I read what I wrote about living with my dad?" The room froze. The smirk fell off my ex's face. Even his lawyer stopped mid-step. The judge looked at him, then at me, and finally at Eli. She nodded. What he read next didn't just change the outcome of the hearing. It broke something open in every person sitting in that room. Even the judge had to wipe her eyes when he was done. And in that moment, I realized that the most powerful voice in that courtroom wasn't mine. It was my son's. 3 years ago, if you had asked me what my life looked like, I would have said I was building something solid. Not glamorous, not perfect, solid. And I was 31, married to Bryce Landon, and raising our son, Eli. I worked the night shift as a nurse at the county hospital. My hair was always in a bun. I lived on caffeine and adrenaline. My world revolved around taking care of people. My patients, my husband, my child. In that order, though I didn't realize it at the time. Bryce worked in real estate. He dressed well, smiled wide, and had a handshake that made people trust him on sight. When we first met, I thought he was the most confident man I'd ever known. He used to tell me I was the heart of our home. He'd kiss my forehead before heading off to show houses or meet clients at rooftop bars I'd never been to. That changed after Eli was born. I remember being home with a newborn, bleeding and exhausted, while Bryce threw on a blazer and said he couldn't cancel another meeting. I remember calling him in the middle of a panic attack while Eli screamed in my arms, and he answered with, "Can this wait?" I'm in the middle of closing. At first, I made excuses for him. I told myself he was working hard for us, that we'd have time together later. But later never came. Bryce stopped looking at me like I was a person. I became an obligation. He started criticizing everything. The way I dressed, how tired I looked. He'd say, "You used to be fun," or "You always play the victim." It got into my head. I started believing maybe I was the problem. Maybe I had changed. Maybe I wasn't enough anymore. My sister Mara was the first person to say the word emotional abuse. She came over one Sunday after Bryce had left without a word. Again. She watched me wash dishes while Eli colored quietly at the table and asked, "Do you even hear the way you talk about yourself anymore?" I shrugged her off. "It's not that bad. He just gets stressed." She looked at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen. "You've stopped asking for anything. That's how they win." I didn't respond. But that night, I sat in bed and wrote down every moment that had made my chest tighten over the past few years. Times he ignored me. Times he blamed me. Times Eli had asked, "Is Daddy mad at us?" I filled 10 pages. That was the first night I didn't cry myself to sleep. I was starting to see the truth. Still, I stayed longer than I should have. I thought keeping the family together was the right thing to do. I thought Eli needed both parents under one roof. What I didn't see until later was how much Eli was absorbing, even in silence. Then came the night Bryce didn't come home until 3 a.m. He reeked of alcohol and perfume. I was sitting on the couch, wide awake, not even angry anymore, just numb. He looked at me and said, "Why are you always waiting for me like some needy little puppy?" And something in me snapped. Not with yelling or crying, just with decision. The next morning, I filed for divorce. That decision set off a chain reaction I wasn't ready for. Bryce turned cold fast. He stopped pretending. Told me I was going to regret this, that I was going to lose everything. He hired a high-priced lawyer before I even found someone to call. I thought it would be simple, joint custody, fair split, civil enough. I was wrong. Bryce fought for full custody, claiming my night shifts made me unreliable and that Eli needed structure. His lawyer built a case that painted me as unstable, unfit, overly emotional. I couldn't afford a great attorney. I drained my savings just to stay in the fight, but I kept showing up, for Eli, for myself, even when I wanted to hide. I started documenting everything, kept a notebook of every exchange, every message, every missed pickup. I stopped arguing with Bryce. I let him talk, let him dig his hole. All I did was tell the truth, quietly, repeatedly, truthfully. But nothing I said seemed to matter. The courtroom felt like it was built for men like Bryce, charming, confident, untouchable. And through it all, Eli watched. He watched me hold it together. He watched Bryce unravel behind closed doors and perform in public. I never asked him to take sides. I just told him he was loved. That's it. What I didn't know then was that Eli was keeping his own record, in his own notebook, just like I had, and he was waiting for his moment to be heard. By the time we got into court, I barely recognized the man sitting across from me. Bryce wore a charcoal suit, hair slicked back, face freshly shaved, like he was headed to a magazine shoot instead of a custody hearing. His lawyer, Mr. Delacroix, looked like he'd been waiting years to tear someone apart for sport. He was polished and sharp-tongued, the kind of man who smiled while twisting the knife. They had a plan. And from the moment the hearing began, I realized they had been preparing for this long before I filed the papers. Every conversation, every text, every moment of frustration I had ever expressed, taken out of context, stripped of meaning, and molded into a story where I was unstable, dramatic, emotionally unfit to care for my own son. "Your Honor," Delacroix said, pacing confidently, "Ms. Hartman works nights. Who is supervising Eli when she's gone? A babysitter? A neighbor? How can she provide stability when she's barely home?" I wanted to speak, to explain that I had arranged night care with a certified nanny, that Eli was always fed, bathed, and loved. But each time I opened my mouth, my voice felt smaller. I wasn't fast enough, not practiced enough. And every word I said felt like it played into their hands. Bryce sat silently beside his lawyer, perfectly composed. Occasionally, he'd glance my way, but it wasn't the look of someone who once loved me. It was smug, like he'd already won. The worst part was the way he talked about Eli, not like a father fighting for time with his son, but like a man fighting over property. He kept using words like best interest, structured environment, and discipline. But none of it sounded like love. It sounded like strategy. Eli had always been sensitive. He noticed everything, even when he didn't say a word. After visits with Bryce, he'd come home quieter. He never talked about what they did together. Sometimes, he'd flinch when I raised my voice, even just to call him from another room. I asked him once if everything was okay at Dad's. He hesitated, then nodded. "He just gets mad a lot," he whispered. I wrote that down, just like I wrote everything down. My lawyer, God bless her, was doing her best, but she was no match for Delacroix. We didn't have resources, we didn't have charm. We had facts, paper trails, and the truth. But it didn't feel like enough. Not in a room where Bryce could spin charm into credibility, and my exhaustion looked like weakness. Delacroix slammed his closing statement down like a gavel. "Ms. Hartman is attempting to take what she didn't earn. She walked away from her marriage. She left her husband and now wants custody out of spite, not responsibility. This is a woman who runs from conflict and uses her job as a shield for her own emotional instability." I didn't flinch, not because I wasn't angry, but because I'd learned that reacting gave them more ammunition. So I sat there, hands folded in my lap, jaw tight, heart pounding. That night, when we got home, Eli came into my bedroom holding a spiral notebook. He looked up at me and said, "Can I say something in court?" I paused. "What do you want to say, baby?" "It's stuff I wrote, about Dad, and about how I feel." He sat beside me and opened the book. His handwriting was a little messy, but every word was clear. He had written pages, stories, feelings, things I didn't know he'd noticed. He had been watching, feeling, remembering, and it was all there on paper. "Do you want me to read it?" I asked gently. "No," he said. "I want to read it, to the judge." I didn't answer right away. I was scared for him, scared of what it would do to him to speak those words out loud. But I also knew he needed to be heard, and that no adult in that courtroom, including me, could speak with the honesty he carried in that notebook. So I said, "Okay, if the judge lets you speak, you tell your truth." He nodded and held that notebook against his chest like it was something sacred. The next morning, we walked into that courtroom together. I held his hand tighter than I ever had before. He didn't look nervous. He looked ready. And deep down, I knew the moment was coming, the one that would change everything. The morning of the final hearing, I didn't put on makeup. I didn't curl my hair or try to look like someone I wasn't. I wore a plain navy blue dress and flats. My nerves were burning just under the surface, but I kept my focus on Eli. He was the only thing that mattered. He came out of his room with his notebook in one hand and his favorite red hoodie zipped up to his chin. He looked smaller than usual but steadier, like he knew exactly what he had to do. He didn't ask again if he could read his words in court. He just walked beside me to the car, quiet, eyes straight ahead. I'd asked my lawyer the night before if Eli could speak. She hesitated. It's rare at this age, but Judge Ramirez is known to consider it if the child is articulate and willing. It's at her discretion. Eli wasn't just willing, he was determined. And I knew this wasn't about helping me win. It was about being heard. My lawyer agreed to request it. We sat through another hour of Bryce's attorney reciting text messages I'd sent at 2 a.m. during panic attacks and quoting lines from journals I'd once shared in therapy. They called me unstable again. They called me overly emotional, inconsistent, obsessive. I didn't respond, not with words. I kept my hands folded on my lap and let my silence carry the weight of everything they didn't understand. Then my lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, with your permission, the child would like to make a brief statement. He's written it himself. He's asked to read it." Judge Ramirez looked over her glasses and said, "Are you sure he understands what he's doing?" My lawyer nodded. "He does." The judge turned to Eli. "Would you like to come forward?" Eli stood. His notebook was pressed tightly to his chest. His shoes made soft sounds on the wooden floor as he walked to the front of the courtroom. I could see Bryce shift slightly in his seat, but he said nothing. Eli sat in the witness chair, small and composed. The judge leaned forward. "Take your time. You may speak when you're ready." He opened his notebook slowly. His voice was soft at first, but gained strength with every sentence. "When I live with Dad," he began, "I feel like I'm walking on glass. I never know when something I do will make him yell. Sometimes he gets mad over nothing, like if I ask a question or if I spill juice. I try to stay quiet when I'm there. I try not to be a problem." Bryce straightened in his seat, face tight, arms crossed. Eli kept reading. "He forgets to make dinner a lot. I eat cereal or stuff from the fridge. One night I told him I had a stomach ache and he said I was faking it. I slept on the floor because my bed had throw up on it. He said I was making it up to get attention." I looked at the judge. Her mouth was drawn in a firm line, but her eyes were soft. She didn't interrupt. "My mom works at night, but she always checks on me. She wakes me up early just to make me pancakes sometimes. She sits with me when I'm scared. She listens. I'm never scared at home. I don't have to hide." Eli turned the page. "I'm not trying to be mean to my dad. I just want to be honest. I want to live with my mom. She makes me feel safe. And I know she loves me, even when I mess up." When he finished, he closed the notebook and looked up. The courtroom was silent. Even Delacroix had nothing to say. Bryce looked stunned, like he'd been slapped. He didn't say a word. For the first time during the entire process, he had no defense. Judge Ramirez cleared her throat. "Thank you, Eli. That was very brave." He nodded once and walked back to his seat. I reached for his hand and he held on tightly. That was the moment the tide shifted. Not because of legal arguments or courtroom tactics, because a 10-year-old boy told the truth in a way that none of us could ignore. He didn't cry. He didn't accuse. He just spoke from the place that mattered most. I didn't need to fight anymore. Eli had done what I couldn't. He made them see the truth, and there was no spinning it, no denying it. Everything changed after that. After Eli read his statement, the entire courtroom seemed to take a breath and hold it. Judge Ramirez leaned back in her chair, quiet and still, and for the first time since this entire process started, I saw something shift in her expression. Not sympathy, not pity, something more grounded. She believed him. Eli returned to his seat beside me, slipping his hand back into mine. He didn't look scared. He didn't look uncertain. He looked like a boy who had told the truth and was finally free of the weight of carrying it alone. Judge Ramirez asked for a recess. Her voice was calm, but I could see how hard she was working to hold her composure. She didn't look at Bryce. She didn't look at me. She simply stood and walked out of the courtroom. When the door closed behind her, the silence stayed. Bryce didn't speak. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, the color drained from his face. Delacroix leaned over to whisper something to him, but Bryce didn't respond. He sat like someone who just realized the mirror had been turned toward him, and what he saw wasn't what he expected. During the break, Eli and I stepped into the hallway. He sat on the bench outside the courtroom and pulled his hoodie over his knees. I rubbed his back and told him how proud I was. He looked up and asked, "Did I mess it up?" "No," I said. "You didn't mess up a thing." He smiled just barely. That tiny curve of his mouth felt like sunlight after years of clouds. When court resumed, everyone returned to their seats. Judge Ramirez entered with a clipboard and her glasses in hand. She sat down slowly, placed her glasses on the bridge of her nose, and looked directly at me. "I want to thank Eli for what he shared this morning," she said. "It's not often that a child speaks with that level of clarity. His words reflected honesty and emotional maturity far beyond his years." She turned to Bryce. "Mr. Landon, the court has reviewed all materials submitted, including the child's statement. While there is no question that you provide financial support and have maintained a presence in your son's life, there is also sufficient evidence to indicate an inconsistent, emotionally volatile environment that is not in Eli's best interest." Bryce blinked but said nothing. Judge Ramirez continued. "Effective immediately, full residential custody is awarded to Ms. Hartman. Mr. Landon will retain visitation rights, supervised for the next 6 months, pending a follow-up review. Any further concerns regarding emotional harm or neglect will be taken very seriously." I exhaled. Not in relief, exactly. It was deeper than that. It was release. The moment when your body finally realizes it no longer has to stay in fight mode. Eli squeezed my hand and leaned his head against my arm. Bryce stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're taking my son away based on a bunch of emotional manipulation." Judge Ramirez didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Sit down, Mr. Landon." He froze, then sank back into his seat. The fight was gone. The show was over. After court adjourned, Mara met us in the lobby with open arms. She wrapped Eli in a hug first, and then me. She didn't ask questions. She just held on. For the first time in years, I let someone else carry a bit of the weight. We walked out of that courthouse into a cloudy afternoon, but it felt like the sun was shining directly on us. Eli reached up and took my hand again, not because he needed reassurance, but because we were walking forward together, stronger. That night, at home, Eli asked if we could frame the last page of his notebook, the one that ended with, "I just want to live where I feel safe." We framed it and hung it in his room. It's still there today. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that truth matters. That even the smallest voice can carry more weight than 1,000 arguments when it comes from the heart. He didn't win because I fought harder in court. He won because he told the truth and because someone finally listened. And in that moment, justice wasn't just a ruling. It was the sound of a child being believed. After the ruling, everything changed, but not all at once. Change doesn't always feel like a celebration. Sometimes it feels like catching your breath after nearly drowning. You don't cheer. You just breathe and hold your child close and hope the quiet stays. Eli and I went home that night and made grilled cheese sandwiches. We didn't talk about court. We watched a movie, something light and silly, and I let him fall asleep on the couch with his head in my lap. I didn't move for 2 hours. I just ran my fingers through his hair and let the silence say what words couldn't. In the days that followed, Bryce didn't reach out. There were no angry texts, no calls, no new tactics. He obeyed the court's order for supervised visits. The sessions were short, strained, and few. Eli never complained, but I noticed how quiet he was the evenings after, like he was trying to fold back into himself. I didn't push. I waited for him to come to me. One evening, while we were walking the dog, Eli asked, "Do I have to go every time they schedule one?" Right now, yes, I told him. But the judge will check in again. You can always talk to her. She listens. He nodded, thoughtful. I just like it better here, with you. That's all he said. That's all I needed to hear. There's no switch that flips after a battle like that. I didn't suddenly feel whole or healed. I still carried the weight of everything I'd given up and everything I'd endured. But little by little, I started reclaiming pieces of myself. I went back to school part-time. I stopped apologizing for being tired. I stopped explaining my decisions to people who never showed up for me. Mara and I grew closer. She came over every weekend to help with laundry, grocery runs, whatever I needed. Not because she thought I couldn't do it, but because she knew I shouldn't have to do it all alone. Eli started drawing again. He filled notebooks with superheroes, comic panels, and made-up creatures with wild hair and big, gentle eyes. He made one character that wore a red hoodie and held a book like a shield. I asked him if it was based on someone he knew. He just smiled and said, maybe, therapy helped. We both went. Separately at first, then together. It gave us a place to say things we hadn't said during the storm. Like how scared he used to feel in the silence after Bryce slammed a door. How I used to cry in the car before walking into work. How love doesn't have to hurt to be real. I stopped thinking of myself as a victim. I started seeing myself as a mother who fought smart, not loud. A woman who learned that strength isn't always about raising your voice. Sometimes it's about letting someone else speak when it's their turn, even when your heart is breaking in the background. People ask why I let Eli read that statement in court. They say it must have been hard to let a 10-year-old carry that kind of responsibility. But it wasn't about letting him carry it. It was about recognizing that he already was. He had been carrying it quietly for years, writing his pain in the margins of math homework and drawing how he felt when no one asked. All I did was give him the space to share it out loud. That wasn't a burden. That was power. And he used it. That framed notebook page still hangs on his wall. The last line reads, I just want to live where I feel safe. It's faded now, but the meaning hasn't changed. Every morning when I walk past it, I remember what we fought for. Not revenge, not punishment, safety, peace, truth. I'm telling this story because someone out there is sitting in silence like I was, doubting herself, questioning if it's really that bad, wondering if it's worth the fight. Let me be clear. If your child is shrinking under someone else's control, if your spirit is breaking to hold everything together, you already know the answer. You don't have to yell to be strong. You don't have to win every argument. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen. And when the time comes, let the truth be spoken, even if it comes from the smallest voice in the room. Because that voice might just change everything. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through or something you're living through right now, I want you to know you're not alone. Whether you're a parent, a child, or someone caught in the middle of a battle no one else sees, your truth matters. You don't have to fight with fire to be strong. Sometimes the most powerful change begins in quiet moments. Moments where you choose honesty, where you choose peace, where you choose yourself. If this video moved you, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me what part of this spoke to you. I read every word, and if you want more true stories about resilience, justice, and the strength we carry even when we think we've lost it, subscribe to the channel. There's more to come, and I'd love for you to be part of this space. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and most of all, thank you for believing that your voice, no matter how small it feels, can make a difference.